This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Jen Kidby, and in this series, I'm delighted to explore how leaders can bring coaching mindset and skills into their everyday leadership. I'll be discussing these themes with authors of the Association for Coaching's new book, Coaching as a Leader. Our aim is to inspire and equip you to help leaders strengthen cultures at work for future generations to thrive. Hello, and welcome to this episode in the Coaching as a Leader podcast series. In this episode, we're exploring one of the themes that's in the second part of the book, which is all about using a coach approach in relationships with employees and teams. This part of the book really gets into the day-to-day life of a leader and the sort of situations where coaching mindset and skills can accelerate performance of employees and teams. To explore this with me, I am delighted to be joined by Tony Worgan, the author of the chapter titled Words Make Worlds, The Power of Language. Tony is a leadership development, coaching and mentoring specialist, and he has over 25 years of experience in media, the manufacturing industry and the arts. He has deep expertise in organizational transactional analysis, which I'm fascinated by, so I'm looking forward to exploring that a little bit more, and extensive experience of organizational life, having worked for the BBC for over 30 years. Tony, welcome.
Thank you very much.
And before we get into this fascinating topic in your chapter, which really is full of such rich insight and practical information for leaders, I'd love you to share a little bit about you and your career journey and your experience of leader coaches.
Well, I think my first introduction to the way that leaders could integrate a coaching approach in their leadership style was probably about 25 years ago. And it was a series of serendipitous circumstances, really, that brought together a range of experiences that have had a lasting effect on me to the extent that I really hold them, the images of them are really vivid for me now. And I was working with a friend who was an occupational psychologist, and this was probably about the year 2000, 2001, and she told me that she'd had a few inquiries about coaching, and she, although she was incredibly well qualified as an occupational psychologist, coaching was pretty new for her, and so she decided to sign up for not a very good, it's fair to say, long-distance course, which I joined her on. Around the same time, I was in a leadership development program, part of which was built around action learning sets. And one of those events was focused on coaching. And I can vividly remember my first experience. We were working in dyads in a group, all talking at the same time, obviously, with the person. We were practicing some coaching skills. And I remember it was almost a submarine and helicopter experience. I was both immersed in the conversation with my colleague, and I had this sort of meta-helicopter awareness that gradually all the others in the room, including the experienced facilitator, stopped speaking and were listening to me and my chum Charlie chatting away. And it was a seminal moment for me, and it really started stimulating my interest in coaching and what it would mean for me to be a leader and integrate coaching into that. At that point, I really had no sense of training to be a coach. Not long after that, I found out the BBC had a very well-regarded internal coach network. The training for that was really comprehensive, and the network had won an award as well, and there weren't many of them around at that time. So I applied for that and joined, and then was so inspired by it, I then went to do a master's in coaching, and after that, many years study of transactional analysis. And in terms of how it affected my role as a leader, it transformed it. It transformed my whole experience of myself as a leader, my identity as a leader, and all my workplace relationships. And I'm really grateful for that. And part of that experience, I must have trained, hundreds of leaders, mostly in the BBC, in bringing a coaching approach to how they worked with colleagues. And for me, it's been the richest, most gratifying experience of my professional career. And I reflect back on it now as I'm getting on in years and think, well, actually, yeah, I did some really good work there from which I derived great joy in learning. And I think I passed it on to others as well.
It sounds like you've had that really pivotal experience where a whole new world was opened up to you around what this could mean. And in listening to you talk about that, it sounds as though for you as a leader, as well as coaching, so you were able to apply it in all aspects of your career at that point.
Yeah, it made a significant difference. I remember, again, vividly, the first time I made a rather tentative step into bringing coaching into a conversation with a colleague. And this was a particular colleague who consistently used to come into my office and essentially say, right, what do I do now? And I was hooked into being a rescuer, even though, I was much more senior than him, several levels above him, and really had no business of telling him the detail of what he should be doing as a reporter in this particular case. And after I'd had this initial training, I really remember saying to him, well, the thing is, I won't say his name, obviously, we'll call him Bob. The thing is, Bob, I'm not paid to do your job for you. You are. So what do you think you should do with this story then? Now, as I reflect back on it now, that was rather clunky and wasn't very authentic. And yet I also remember thereafter, gradually, he stopped coming in asking for me to essentially rescue him and give him all the answers to how he should do everything, to effectively take all responsibility for his actions onto my own shoulders. And since that experience, I've noticed when I'm training coaching leaders, among the many things that they bring up as things they want to resolve is this sense of frustration that people aren't performing in the way that they would wish, often because they haven't really told them. They haven't said, they haven't named it, which I think is a signature strength of leader coaches. They're able to name what needs to be named. Maybe we'll talk a bit about how you might do that later. And also a sense in which they are hooked into rescuing their colleagues and essentially not only doing their own job, but in a way doing their colleagues' jobs for them as well. And of course, the burden of that is just overwhelming for many of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a common trap. And one of the things that was really important in putting the book together was to take what's most impactful and powerful around coaching in some of these fields and to help leaders integrate it into their everyday conversations, everyday relationships, like that example you gave of Bob coming into the room and you deliberately changing that dynamic. And I would love to pick up on, there's so many things you said already, Tony, that I really want to dive into around rescuing and some of those patterns and getting hooked in. Just before we do that, and sticking with you for a moment longer, what is it about this book that made you want to be a part of it?
Oh, gosh. I was so eager and remain so eager, and I'm very grateful to be invited, I guess because it's consistent with my ethical perspective on great leadership. And there's a practical reason as well. There's, I think, and this comes from my direct experience, so as well as whatever other theories and learning there may be, this comes from my direct experience, both as a leader myself and when I've worked and trained leaders in this field. And it's this way of inhabiting your identity as a leader in an authentic way, able to be present, not perfect, able to confront, not be confrontational, but to put before people what's going on, I think is the most significant change that a leader can make. Not only in terms of creating an environment where people can thrive, not just survive, and where they themselves can thrive and grow and learn and there's a social justice aspect to this too, because I think better leaders create better working environment. And of course, the ramifications for society are huge. So for me, it was a real privilege to make a contribution about the field in leadership and coaching that I'm most passionate and interested in.
I remember when you and I first spoke about what the topic might be for your chat, something you were passionate about that was very, very practical and very, very deep. And I can remember we landed very, very quickly on this whole topic of language and how the surface structure of language gives you so many clues as to what's happening underneath. And I think it's one of the simplest things, isn't it, for language, the words. In some ways, it's so simple. You don't have to pay to go on a course or do a master's to choose different words. And yet those habits and the patterns, like you described with the example with your colleague, sometimes those habits of language take a little bit of unpicking. So introduce us. We've started to delve into it already, but the title of your chapter, Words Make Worlds. Just unpack that a little bit for what does that mean for a leader who wants to bring this into how they lead?
And I think before I answer that, I think it's important to say, and no doubt all the contributors in the chapters in the book and these podcasts will say the same thing, that you can't separate one area of integrating coaching into the way that you lead from another. So, of course, in terms of the language we use, as you were describing then, this might emerge at a social level. And, of course, there are all sorts of things going on at a psychological level, and some things that are going on that it's important for anybody reading the book to look at the whole, not just one chapter. And so I've always been interested in how language defines ourselves and our environment and our relationships with colleagues and how we choose to use the language. And then as a leader coach, how we may not only be aware and in the moment of our own choices for the words that we use, but also particularly notice the patterns of language in others. And as we were just getting into this subject now, what came to my mind was the subject of discounting. Discounting language. The kind of language is language that diminishes or perhaps exaggerates and makes grandiose an aspect of reality, usually discounting reality. And we can discount ourselves and others in a whole range of ways, diminish ourselves, diminish others. Maybe we diminish the significance of circumstances through our language, diminish our potency and our authenticity in sometimes quite everyday ways. To give you an example, I was on a phone call earlier today, and the person on the phone call began, I wonder if you would mind, I just would like a word about this particular matter, and I'm sure you're really busy. I just want to have a conversation about this, if you would be so kind. And that very just, I notice it often, even people in emails use it, the word just. I'm just wanting a conversation. And for me, when I hear somebody say just, I'm wondering what it is they're discounting. And in that example, they're discounting their own right to have a conversation with me, to express their needs, which in that case might be to ask me something. And these are the kind of patterns of language that I think the leader coach, once you become attuned, and to do that you need to be present, of course, and to listen. Once you become attuned to it, you will notice the patterns that people use. So, for example, if you offer somebody some praise about their work, we'll probably talk about the language of strokes, as transactional analysts would call them a bit later. But if you offer somebody some praise, is the first thing they do to discount, use language that discounts the praise, dismisses it, because perhaps through their life they may have been uncomfortable receiving compliments. And I've often come across this too, where a colleague might say, oh, it was nothing. nothing, discounting the fact that they'd been up all night working for the whole weekend, or, oh, well, it wasn't me, it was the team, darling. And when a leader, I think, becomes attuned to that, and I noticed myself as a leader, I had a colleague who was one of the most effective, highly regarded leaders who worked for me. And she invariably used discounting language and discounted herself, her own capability. I hope this doesn't sound sexist. I've noticed in the workplace, women do that more than men, in my personal experience. And she discounted herself often by blocking any praise or commendation and essentially saying, well, it was the whole team. Well, yes, of course, there were other people involved in whatever the project might be, and she was the leader, and she was the person who brought this project to conclusion. So I think when we become aware of language, it opens up a whole range of possibilities for us, and that might be to use language very simply. And that is not only noticing the language others use, but being much more aware of the language we use ourselves. And I'm not really making the point that some people say about using simple language and short sentences in the way that you might write something. I'm just thinking, being aware of what is the meaning you are conveying both at a social level, and what are you really saying at a psychological level? What's the underlying message that's there that perhaps isn't being expressed?
That use of the word just, I can remember a previous organisation I worked at, and a number of our professional administrative colleagues would say, well, I'm just an admin, or I'm just the secretary. I would hear it over and over again and would always wonder, what's that about you, about the system, about the culture? And then what can I do to not shame you for using that word? What can I do to remove the discount? Like, what sort of advice would you give to somebody if you are hearing a particular pattern? Let's maybe take just, because I agree with you. I think it's pervasive.
Well, my thought is, I think it would be important to say that what I'm offering here obviously is a very simple, I hope not superficial, but a very simple synthesis of a lot of different themes and ideas and theories and practical tools that one can use. And I say that because, of course, there might be something in the just that expresses something about the whole organisation. It might be something in the just that it's expressing something about your team and about you as a leader. In other words, have you as a leader discounted the colleague who said, I'm just an admin, I'm just a receptionist? And it might be that. So there are those factors to consider. I think for me, the leader who's aware would confront it. And I think it's really important language here, because I know some people are really uncomfortable about the word confront, because it implies confrontation. It implies imposing your perspective. Really what I'm talking about is naming it, noticing it and bringing it to the attention of both of you. And I might say, I've noticed that when you come and ask for some of my time, you say, I just want a moment of your time. I hope I'm not bothering you. In other words, I noticed that you apologize for asking me something that you may need from me. And I might say, how come? I might even inquire, what is it about me that's leading you to discount your permission to ask me something that's important? And I think in order to do that, though, as a leader, you need to pay attention to language and your behavior, of course, and the culture and so on consistently. So I remember many times that leaders who I've trained in how to integrate coaching into their approach would say, well, if I were to do what I've just suggested there, Tony, my colleagues would think I'd gone barking mad, because that's not how I behave. So what if I subtly do that? They might clam up and not say anything, and probably they're right. So the thought I'd have is, well, I've often said to them, well, what would be so wrong in saying to your colleagues, I've been doing some training and learning about the way I approach my leadership, and you may notice some differences in how I interact with you. So I think being authentic and naming what's going on for you is really valuable. And I also think there is something about the contact and contract, which I talk about a bit in the chapter as well, how you build a relationship with a colleague before you ask them that. And part of that's about permission. Do you give yourself permission to raise it? And another common theme, I think, for the capable leader coach is they give themselves permission to name what needs to be named appropriately, with care and with sensitivity, due sensitivity. So before naming something like that, I think there would need to be some permission given to myself and sought. So it might be that I would invite the other person to decline my offer to point something out to them which I think would be helpful, or to accept it. And part of that, of course, is about the language of trust. And we might come on in due course to strokes and how you can create an environment where gradually over time you can build trust. So you take a lot of the heat out of what some people call difficult conversations. I confess I can't stand that phrase. Nevertheless, that's the phrase. That's the phrase in the industry, isn't it? And goodness knows how.
What's your phrase for that? Because that comes up a lot. Difficult conversations. What's your way of talking about it?
And it comes up often when you're training leader coaches, and I prefer to call them courageous conversations, because it seems to me that difficult conversations to start with, when we're talking about language, I've noticed when people are role-playing a difficult conversation, the very fact that they've joined the difficult conversations course kind of tells you all you need to know really about what they're bringing into the course in the first place. So I think if you're prepared for courageous conversations, then over time it can take the heat out of what might be a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
If you've been, as a leader, integrating this consistently over time, because you build trust, and you build trust through behavior, of course, consistent behavior and language. Something
we explore, or you explore in your chapter and through other parts of the book as well, is that difference of doing some coaching techniques and really integrating this as a way of being as a leader. And when you touch there on being able to bring the use of language into the present and bring attention to it, does draw on trust, which is built over time. And with language as well, to be able to, the phrase you used earlier, I wrote it down because I loved it, be present, not perfect, I think is a very powerful way for a leader to show up, to be fully present and listening to language and noticing behavior as well.
Well, that reminds me of a time, and I'm going back to when I first became interested in this, and I learned a lot from some actors, Elena Prokopiou and Roger Lloyd-Thompson, who are two actors I used to work with many years ago, certainly when role-playing and leadership development was perhaps it's still a thing. And I learned a lot from them, more in some ways from all sorts of other leadership theories, and they were sort of coaches themselves. And I remember Roger was role-playing a role as a direct report, and one of my colleagues was role-playing being a leader, and they were essentially role-playing the leader's experience of a conversation with a particular colleague. And it probably comes as no surprise that although this was a role play, both parties began reenacting a parallel process, reenacting together, even as it's a role play, what was really happening between the leader and the individual that the actor was role playing. And it became really heated and uncomfortable, and the leader got stuck, didn't know what to say. And I vividly remember Roger saying, and this is about being present, not perfect. Roger saying, it's all right to start again, you know. So if the conversation has got heated and you've fallen out and there's conflict, you're a human being. Conflict is allowed, it's normal. And it's okay to say, look, actually, we've just got really heated here and we've got a bit stuck. And this isn't what I wanted. And I'm sure it's not what you wanted. And I'm feeling really uncomfortable now. So how about we take a break? Let's get a cup of coffee. And would you be willing, in that sort of non-violent communication, would you be willing, and few people would say no, would you be willing to come back and let's start again? I thought, of course. And there was something about the essence of being present, not perfect there, because if you use the wrong language, it's okay to say, I got that wrong. I'm sorry. If the relationship founders in some way, and this is where the contracting comes in, it's really valuable to have a conversation about how can we make sure that doesn't happen when we reconvene. What do we need to do? And this is very coaching language, I guess, but what do we need to do to resolve the conflict if it emerges again? And if I'm saying something where you feel really angry, how will you let me know? Part of that coaching process, which professional coaches would use in a formal coaching contracted relationship. And yet I still think leaders could learn so much about bringing coaching, contracting into all their relationships, because it makes boundaries clear. Because language, as well as behavior, makes the boundaries of how we're going to work together, what's okay and not okay. How can I make sure my needs are met and your needs are met too? And how can I be clear and direct about what I need from you? Because the other fact of the matter is that I think a lot of people, when they learn about being a leader coach, they call it a soft skill. I think it really isn't. I think it's a difficult skill to learn, as though somehow they're not allowed to be direct in what they want from somebody. Or indeed, sometimes to be directive. You know, if there's an emergency on the plane, I don't suppose the captain comes onto the microphone and says, ladies and gentlemen, what do you think would be the best solution? We're crashing. What do you think we should do here? They'll say, brace, brace, brace. And so this is where I think building trust over time, using language in a way that's effective and not intending to be perfect with it, knowing that you're fallible, as are all your colleagues, really can open up a whole different way of being as a leader. Take a lot of the pressure off too.
That was just going through my mind, actually, Tony, that sense of how much more ease there is if one were to give oneself permission to go, I didn't get that right. Let's start again. Some of the heat and the pressure goes away. I'd love to go back to one of the first examples you shared in this conversation about rescuing, because I see this as a really common pattern for leaders, that the rescuing or I know sometimes it's talked about as you take the monkeys onto your own back rather than leaving it where it should be. You gave a great example of a colleague who came into your office and you would fall into the trap of rescuing. Could you just unpack what that is a little bit? Because I think people listening will really relate to it.
It's one of the ways that transactional analysis as a discipline, if you like, as a method, has gradually become integrated into the vernacular of leadership development. So there's something called, I know this partly because other people who've got no relationship with TA tell me, something called the drama triangle, which is a way of describing the games, psychological games that can emerge between people. Really, the drama triangle was designed for and belongs in a therapeutic context. And some of the risk when thinking about, in simple terms, about rescuing, persecuting, or being a victim.
And those are the three, for those who don't know much about transactional analysis, those are the 3 points on a triangle called the drama triangle.
And the premise behind it in very simple terms is that we may inhabit one of those roles, and often we might switch around those roles in the course of a conversation. And the reason I'm hesitating to answer this as directly as you inquire is just to say that I count, you count, and context counts. So when I'm working with somebody as a leader, I count, so it's okay for me to have my needs and expectations met. You count, your needs and expectations can reasonably be met when they're reasonable and appropriate to the context, and context counts. So sometimes if I'm, as a leader, rescuing colleagues, or maybe even persecuting them, playing a psychological game of blemish, which is one of the games labeled by the psychiatrist, in fact, who developed transactional analysis in the late 50s and early 60s. He came up with all sorts of canny names for the psychological games that people play. So if I'm a persecutor, that kind of leader who finds fault in absolutely everything, You get no sort of positive strokes out of him saying that was a great job or you're great to work with. They focus on the criticism. Sometimes that behavior is not only about the relationship that's going on there, but there may be something about the culture. And I can think about the cultures that I've worked in my professional life, and often that kind of behavior that emerges in leaders says something about the broader culture in which the leader is situated. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. So one of the reasons I'm passionate about this subject is because I think this gives leaders the permission and the potency to be able to inhabit a way of leading that where you are less drawn into the culture and you can give yourself permission to lead in a more effective way. And so coming back to answer your question directly, yeah, I think that a lot of leaders would say to me, and it's quite a reasonable challenge to the notion of integrating a coaching approach in how they lead, is that it might take more time. Because if I'm going to enter into a dialogue with a colleague about, what would be the indicators of success here? What might get in the way? How might you sabotage yourself? Or how might the organization sabotage this work? It requires time to have that kind of conversation. And so I think one of the reasons they get into the rescuing, being directive and telling their colleagues what they want to do, effectively doing their job for them, I think they have jobs. They're paid to do them. So why not give them permission to make their own choices within certain boundaries? Is that, of course, it's much quicker, ostensibly. If I tell you, as when Bob came into my room, if I told him exactly how to go about producing this particular news report, it probably would have been a lot quicker than the conversations I had with him to develop his skill. Of course, that might be the case in the short term, but not in the long term. Because, of course, if I keep reinforcing this pattern through the language and behavior I'm using by rescuing Bob every time he comes and asks a question, being present and perfect means not perfect. That was an interesting parapraxis slip, being present and perfect, wasn't it? All the psychoanalytically trained people might be curious about that. Being present, not perfect, would mean that I'm aware of the pattern of our interaction. And if then I take the time to inquire, so what is it that you need from me that you're not getting? I'm hearing you asking for help from me when what I see is a very capable person before me who has all the resources to do this. So what is it you really need from me? Then they're going to come back and ask me that question less often. I'm developing their capability. I'm being clear that we've got a shared understanding of what this role is, this project is about. So often I've noticed training leaders to use coaching is what they say to me is now they're much clearer because there's a conversation about the work. What is this project about? To what extent do we have a shared understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve here? And that, I think, is so liberating for leaders, and it certainly was to me, because there was a much better chance that we'd had a clearer sense that when that meeting came to an end, when the conversation had finished, we had a good enough, not perfect, good enough shared understanding of what it is that we were trying to do and how that contracting bit about how we're going to go about doing it. What would happen if it all goes pear-shaped? How will we support one another? If one of us is struggling, how will we name it? What if somebody leaves who's critical to this project? How are we going to account for that? That takes time, but it saves, in my opinion, saves time in the long run.
Yeah, that short-term versus long-term dilemma. And of course, sometimes a leader might choose to go down the short-term fix route. But I guess listening to you, it's being aware if that becomes an embedded pattern, embedded habit, rather than an active choice of how do I move this situation on.
Well, and of course, I think it comes back to that in those circumstances, we are less likely to get caught up in a game. I mean, another classic game, which Eric Byrne called Why Don't You, often connected with another game called Yes, But. And I remember driving back from the north of England back to the West Country where I was living at the time with one of my colleagues who was more experienced in this sort of senior roles that we both had. more experienced than I. His approach to leadership at that time was much more coaching than mine. And I had some difficulties with the performance of a colleague. And we just got stuck into a why don't you yes but game, which I look back now and smile about. It was such an exemplar of that, because I said, well, I've got this issue with Tom and I don't know how to get him to do whatever it might be. He's infuriating in the way he does this, and I've had enough. And my chum said, well, why don't you do X? And I said, yes, but I've already tried X. And it didn't work. And he said, well, why don't you do Y? And I said, well, I can't do Y. It would just be a bit too awkward because, and this went on, I'm not joking, for about an hour and a half. And gradually I got more and more annoyed, because at no time did he say to me, Tony, what do you need from me now? And at no time did I say, Mark, what I need from you is I need to express my dissatisfaction with this situation I find myself, and I just want you to listen for a moment. And then after you've listened to me for a while, I'd really like to have a conversation about your perspective on what you're hearing from me, so I can come up with some better solutions than I've used before. That would have been a much more mature and useful conversation, and we both wouldn't have got so annoyed with each other. Because, of course, actually, I wasn't really asking for help. And my colleague's habit was, even though he is much more of a coaching leader than I was at the time, his habit was to rescue everybody and tell them what to do and offer advice. It was a world of advice. And, of course, the problem with the advice giver is that you don't have to live with the consequences of the advice.
This is very true. Very true. And that story that you just shared, it's such a brilliant example of how looking beyond the surface of what's being shared, looking at what's actually going on under the surface and breaking the pattern as you did. Tony, there's so much in your chat. There really is. This is the tip of the iceberg that we've touched on. There is one more thing I'd love you to talk a little bit about before we finish up for today, and that's about strokes. You mentioned this a couple of times. Could you just give a little bit of a background to what that is in a leadership context, and how you can become more mindful and, again, address some of those habits that we sometimes fall into?
I can, and which comes with the caveat, it's a rich and quite deep subject. And so I'm going to simplify it, and I'm going to focus on the way that leaders might think about strokes in terms of the language they use. Because, of course, strokes, which are units of recognition, interactions between people, some of them are interactions that are non-verbal, about a nod, a wink, a smile, or a non-smile. I'm going to focus on the language here. And when I've worked with leader coaches, I've found again and again they find this, because it's a relatively understandable and easily changed way of interacting with colleagues, that they often find it helpful. So essentially, yes, a stroke is a unit of recognition, if you like, and an interaction. And think of it in verbal terms. They can be positive or negative, conditional or unconditional. And in a way, that's all you've got to remember. So a positive stroke, if I say something to you that's positive and it's unconditional, it's about your being, who you are. So it might be, Jen, I really love working with you. You're such a joy to work with. So that's about who you are. If I'm offering you a negative unconditional stroke, it might be, Jen, you're hopeless. You're a useless coach, or whatever it might be. I don't know. Well, why were you ever born into coaching? And
thanks, Tony. That's great.
there are cultures like that. There are leaders like that.
I am aware. Yeah.
And there are conditional strokes. So they're positive conditional strokes. So it might be, I say to you, I really like the way that you did this piece of work. How when you wrote that report for me, it had a very clear narrative, had a great introduction, and the structure helped me in presenting it to the board. So I'm offering a stroke about what you do rather than your being. So this is about giving strokes comments, if you like, about your actions. And it's being specific about what they are.
It's
Absolutely.
very specific. Yeah.
If it's negative unconditional. Some people might call this negative feedback, if you like. Again, it does the same work because it's about your doing, not your being. So I might give you a positive conditional stroke. I really like the length of that report and the way you structured it. What didn't work for me, and I think confused me in the reading of the report, is the conclusion didn't seem to make any sense with what you'd put before. Because, and then I might add some more detail. Now, what this can do is, over time, it can build trust so people are very clear about what you stand for, what's okay around here. Because I believe that when you're clear about what you stand for, people know where they stand. So in developing the stroke profile in your department, you can do that by analysing, and in the book I think I share how to do that, what's the nature of the strokes in your department. And I've worked in places where the strokes are mostly negative, very often unconditional, and certainly even if they're conditional, there's very few positive strokes, conditional or unconditional. And I'm very struck by the work done, particularly in the University of Pennsylvania in America, and all those social psychologists working in the positive psychology field who've done research on this would say that the ideal, relating it back to strokes, the ideal would be to have something like between 3 or 5 positive to negative. That creates the best thriving, performing culture. If it goes too far, and in transactional analysis terms, we would say it's a discounting because it's getting too grandiose, to something like 10 or 12 to run, darling, you're all fantastic, oh, we're all great around here, and I've worked for that leader as well. It drives performance down because people start becoming, how can I really improve? Where are my development areas? Nobody's being honest about those. And I think it's such a simple way of both getting a sense of what the culture is around here and what's it like for you as a leader. Who do you notice that works for you who rejects positive strokes? Coming back to my colleague earlier on, positive strokes, she would discount them. It wasn't okay for her to accept them. Who do you give strokes to? Who do you ignore? Because if somebody is behaving in ways that you don't want them to behave, it's useful to ask, how come? What is it around the stroke profile here and the way I give strokes that might be contributing to their behavior? Because sometimes we know that for some people, negative strokes are better than no strokes at all. Because, of course, even if you're behaving in a way that is unwanted, at least you're being noticed. And I think it's such a powerful way of developing your coaching approach as a leader, because then you can start being more potent, authentic, effective as a leader by taking note of the strokes you use. And if you're willing to use negative conditional strokes, people then will get used to sometimes there's something that you're telling me that isn't very good, but you're not making it about me. You're not making it about my being. You're not saying I'm useless.
As you describe that, the conditional, the more specific strokes, in your experience, are those the most valuable, the ones that leaders should focus on the most?
I don't actually. I also think positive, unconditional strokes are really valuable too. I think sometimes I hear people talking about feedback and they confuse feedback with praise. And I would say maybe a positive, unconditional stroke is about praise. I really enjoy working with you. I thought that lunch was delicious. I thought that when you come into the work smiling in the morning, saying good morning, it creates such a fantastic environment to work in. I think that's wonderful for people to hear if it's authentic and true. Of course, being present means that you're aware in the moment about what's your intention here in saying this, and is it authentic and true? Because, of course, if you start using strokes in a manipulative way and in a way that's disingenuous, people will get it very quickly. And, of course, that drives trust down. And I think being mindful of the relationship between positive and negative and making them specific and detailed, then and getting the ratio right, then that takes the heat out of what some people call the difficult conversation, because the individual is more used to hearing your authentic experience of how they show up in the workplace and their performance.
Tony, your chapter has so much. There's so much in it that is practical and deep and meaningful. And to wrap up this conversation, I'd love to close with two things from you. One, a piece of advice that you would give to a leader coach to bring some of this into how they lead. And then secondly, a question that you'd encourage them to think about and to take away and to mull over around this topic.
Okay, I think I would offer something from another transactional analyst called Steve Cartman. And this way of thinking about relationships was designed for family therapy, and yet I still think it obtains in the workplace. And that is, bring it up, which is about naming it. Bring it up, talk it up, wrap it up, is much better than save it up, blow it up, mop it up. And when I've worked with leaders developing their capacity to use coaching more in the way they work, one of the things that they find the greatest challenge is the bringing it up, the naming, saying what needs to be said here, and then being open to discuss it. And the wrap it up requires probably some collaboration, some creative solutions to come to a conclusion, if you come to a conclusion that day. But that's I'd recommend it. I hope it doesn't sound like advice.
Just say that one more time, those two phrases, because those are very powerful.
Bring it up, talk it up, wrap it up is better than save it up, blow it up, and mop it up. And I think if I were to invite leader coaches to ask a question, in this moment anyway, it would be, what are you not naming that needs to be named, and how come you're avoiding it?
What a brilliant place to end this conversation. Tony, thank you so much for today, for sharing what you have, and for working with me and the team over the last 3 years as well, to be such an important part of this book. I very much appreciate it, and I'm very excited for people to start reading it and putting it into practice to help make organizations better places for everybody.
Thank you for all those positive strokes. I appreciate them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. To help you develop your coaching expertise, you can also explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, member benefits, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends.